Welcome to our lesson on the four-part division of the land of Israel. This lesson is actually going to be spread over 3 weeks. So we'll have our first one today and then for the 2 weeks following that. And we're going to divide up Israel into 4 long sections running north and south. And this is going to help you understand the land a lot better. It's going to give you a framework. I've talked to people who've had the privilege of taking a personal tour to the Holy Land, and they're always very excited about the trip there and what they experienced. And I'd say, if you have the opportunity to go, certainly go. If someone wants to sponsor you to go for it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But one thing I've noticed when I talk to people about their trip to Israel, I say, what did you do on the first day? And they say, well, we went to Jerusalem and explored around there. And that was really fun. How about the second day? Well, we went up to Galilee, saw the Sea of Galilee, even took a boat ride around. Okay. How about the third day? Where'd you go on the third day? And they hesitate and they just can't remember because it all seems to blur together by about the third day. They see so much without any context. All the sights, they can't really tell Mount Hermon from Megiddo after a while. And so hopefully by this course and learning about the 4-part division of the land, you'll have the framework to understand the geography of Israel. It's a very diverse geography, but we're going to use this framework to reduce it down to a very simple model that I think you'll be able to understand. Okay, well, let's look at our lesson for today, the 4-part division of the land. We're going to just cut the land of Israel up into 4 strips. The first strip being the coastal plain along the Mediterranean. The next region is the central mountainous spine going right up the center of the country. And then the Rift Valley, which is that deep valley where the Jordan River is. It extends from Turkey all the way down to Mozambique, Africa. We call it the Jordan Valley, that portion of the Rift Valley, we call it the Jordan Valley in Israel. And then moving farther east, we have the Transjordan, this high-level plateau, which is basically the same height as the central mountainous spine. So here's what Israel looks like on a map. You can see on the left-hand side next to the Mediterranean Sea, the green coastal plain, and then it turns kind of a yellowish-orange in the center. That's the central mountainous spine. And then the gray area to the right of that is the Jordan Valley or Rift Valley. And then as we move to the east, it rises back up to the Transjordan, which is pretty much the same height as the central mountainous spine. The coastal plain is a flat area. It's fertile. And for most of the Old Testament history, it was a place where the Philistines lived. You can see in this slide, there's the beach along the Mediterranean Sea. And as we look up the coast in this model of Israel, we can see just how flat the coastal plain is. We're looking north. It's interrupted by the Carmel mountain range up near Akko and Haifa in that area, and where the mountains jut all the way out to the coast. But you can see it's a flat area. The central mountainous spine is a ridge of hills right up the center of the country. We call it a spine because as you look at a person's back, you see the bumps of the vertebrae, and when you look at a map of Israel, it kind of looks like the same thing. And so the central mountainous spine was where the Israelites lived for most of Old Testament history. So the Philistines were down on the coast. The Israelites were up in the central mountainous spine. It's not as fertile as the coastal plain, and so that's where the Israelites lived. In looking at this topographical map, a cross-section of Israel. It's like we cut the land of Israel at the waist and we kind of pulled back the different parts, and now we're looking north. So we start on the left. We see the Mediterranean Sea, of course, at sea level, the coastal plain. The land begins to rise up to the central mountains where it kind of peaks out at Jerusalem, and then we'll see later descends down to the Rift Valley. The Rift Valley is the deepest valley in the world. Along the shore of the Dead Sea is the lowest elevation of any place on land in the world. This is a huge, long crack in the Earth's crust. Like I said, it goes from Mozambique, Africa, all the way up to Turkey. And so it's a huge, huge geographical feature. And there the temperatures are quite hot and it's dry. And as you see in this topographical map, if you follow the elevation over, it's below sea level. So the Dead Sea is below sea level. It's kind of hard to conceive of that, but that's true. Let's move over to the east to the Transjordan. This area, we're going to kind of generalize here, but it's a high-level plateau. It's about the same level as the central mountainous spine. We can see that, it is about the same level as the central mountainous spine. Things drop down in the Jordan Valley, and then they come up pretty much to the same elevation as the central mountainous spine. Well, let's look at some of the regions, biblical regions of Israel, what they're called in the Bible. We're just going to look at one verse out of Deuteronomy 1:7. It says, "Turn and set your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah, in the hill country and in the lowland, and in the Negev, and by the seacoast and the land of the Canaanites, in Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." So let's try to identify some of the places on this map. The hill country would be represented in green, the hill country of Israel, pretty much synonymous with the central mountainous spine. The Arabah is a designation for the Jordan Valley north and south of the Dead Sea. The lowland is the area kind of rolling hills that separates the coastal plain from the hill country, from the central mountainous spine. And so this is an area of rolling hills, and it kind of kept the Philistines and the Israelites somewhat separated. It's called the Shephelah in Hebrew. That term is really just a transliteration of the Hebrew. The Negev in Hebrew means south, and it is in the south of the country and a very dry area. And of course the seacoast, which we're calling the coastal plain, and then Lebanon, which is up to the far north. We see it's next to Mount Hermon. We have Mount Lebanon, so that would be the far north of the country. We can't see the Euphrates River. That's kind of off our map to the upper right. So these are some of the regions that the Bible describes. Now we're going to look at some other regions that the Bible will also describe, like Galilee, the Jezreel Valley, the Plain of Sharon, the Jordan Valley, Gilead. We'll be looking at some of these other places. But this one verse gives us quite a few of the terms that the Bible uses to describe the land. Well, let's take a brief look at archaeology. This is going to be a very brief introduction to archaeology and how archaeology is helpful in determining time periods. Okay, all over Israel you'll see these mounds. They call them tells, which means a ruin. And the way these mounds get formed is because that particular site is valuable. It may have a good water source. It may be at the intersection of transportation. There may be fertile fields in the area. So people want to live there. And so over time, over the centuries, when people fight over that particular spot, that particular city, an army may come along and conquer it. And so the city's in a state of rubble, and so they just build on top of that. And then a number of years later, another army comes along and they want to conquer that place. And so a layer of destruction builds up, and then they add and they build right on top of that. And so this just keeps going layer upon layer, getting taller and taller over time. So we see here in this diagram that the oldest layer, of course, is at the bottom. The newest layer would be at the top. And archaeologists have different names for these time periods, going all the way back to the Chalcolithic period, the early Bronze period, Middle Bronze. Some of these periods are determined or designated by the metal that was primarily used at that time. Okay, so here's a model of a tell, and you can see the different layers or strata. And what would happen in a typical Israelite home with a dirt floor, and they would use pottery as their vessels, and pottery is pretty cheap and available. And so when a pot would break, as they inevitably do, a lot of times they would just sweep it up and it would just become part of the floor, the dirt floor. And then an army would come along, they'd destroy the city, and that layer of pottery would just get sealed up in that layer of destruction. And then the new occupants of the site would build on top of that. And so we can see different layers of pottery. Now, we humans are very style conscious. And even in ancient times, there would be different styles of pottery for different time periods. Certain shapes and styles would come into fashion, and then they would fade out. And archaeologists have been able to determine, as they've dug up tells in various places, that, oh, this pottery matches that pottery. The style does. And so they can determine that they're from the same time period. Let me give you an example of style today. If I were to hold up a brand new iPhone, okay, and you could recognize that, and I'd hold up a Nokia, maybe a 3310, if you're old enough to know what that is, you could tell right away that the iPhone is newer than the Nokia. The style is different. In fact, if I were to hold up two cell phones that are only about maybe 3-5 years apart, you could tell which one was newer, which one was older, just by the style. We're very style conscious. And so pottery, because of its style, enables archaeologists to determine time periods. Well, here's yours truly working at a tell. Archaeology, for the most part, is pretty tedious, boring work, digging in the dirt, long hours of sifting, and every once in a while you'll find something that's significant, but you have to carefully go through a lot of dirt. And here's a chart that shows pottery in the various time periods. So starting at the uppermost part, the Neolithic and Chalcolithic period had its own style. The early Bronze had a slightly different style, the Middle Bronze, and so forth. So when archaeologists find pottery that resembles one of these rows here on this chart, they know, oh, that's from that particular time period. So they can build what we call a relative chronology. This comes before that. This is later than that. And then hopefully by some maybe historical record that says this happened in the 4th year of the king, we can work our way to more of an absolute chronology. But archaeology establishes the basis for a relative chronology. Well, that's our brief lesson on archaeology.